just looking at kind of the main ways that you can prepare for your MCQs in exams, and different ways to think about essay practices if that's part of your exams, and kind of how to look after yourself during exams, which is also fairly important, and I imagine you've been drilled into a lot with COVID and all of that stuff. So yeah, like I said a second ago, it's going to be quite interactive, so if you haven't already, please do log on to Socrates. Yeah, this is just the aims of the session, just going to look at MCQs and essays and revising. So if you could all log on to Socrates, that would be great. I can only see 2 people so far, so if you're having problems, or if I've typed the room name in wrong, do let me know. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go through 5 short MCQs, and we're just going to have a bit of a think about kind of easy traps to fall into when you're doing them. Someone type in and correct me if I'm wrong, but you have less than a minute per question in the Oxford exam, certainly. So actually they are very high pressured. And so it's quite easy to know things, but not to write the right answer in the MCQs. So yeah, just having a think about where some of our blind spots are is quite an important one. So if you want to go ahead and answer the first question, which is, which of the following is most strongly associated with type 2 diabetes? I'll give you a couple more seconds just to answer that. And as always, if you have any questions or comments or stuff, do just type in the chat, and later there'll be a Socrates box for questions if you want to put stuff in anonymously. Let's have a look. Okay, so most of you went for obesity, and I'm assuming one of you went for hypertension. So this is an important point to make out, in that the most basic thing you need to do, and it's going to sound really obvious, is just read the question. Lots of people focus on the wrong bits of the question because they either don't read all of it, or they read what they want the question to say because you know what answer you want to give. So this question asks, which is most strongly associated with type 2 diabetes? All of the answers there are associated, but actually the one that is most strongly associated is obesity. So you need to like go through, and you'll have been told it from the start, highlight under questions the important words. And if even though you might not have much time, if you do that, even just in your mind very briefly, you've got a better chance of giving the right answer, rather than an answer that is right, but not what the examiners want from you. Okay, question number 2. Which of these is a key feature of binge eating? We're thinking psychology now. And I'm going to give you, for this one, you've got another 10 seconds to answer, because that's about how long you'd have by the time we've thought through this. So 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so this is quite a good example. So a few of you went for large amounts of eating. Some of you went for eating secretively. Some of you went for loss of control. So it's tempting. I think the fact that large amounts was first means that I'm sure not all of you, but some of you just went for that one because it's the first answer on there. And it is correct. One feature of binge eating is eating large amounts, and that can happen. But actually, if we're talking about key diagnostic features, the kind of more underlying problem is a loss of control of eating. And so that is the correct answer. So once you've read through the question properly, make sure you go through all the answers. I kind of gave you an artificial time limit there because that's how it will feel with some of the questions. But even with a time limit, you need to read through all of the answers. You might think it's quite mean of me to do that, but trust me, you'll get in the exam and there will be questions that you just have to do. But always read through all the answers. Often you'll know what the right answer is before you've even read the options, because you're all clever people. You've all been to lectures or watched them online, and you'll kind of in your subconscious somewhere know what the answer is often. So what is quite useful to do, and what I found myself doing, even if you're on a computer, just like getting a piece of paper. I think you can have blank paper with you in the exam, correct me if I'm wrong, and I just put it under the answers. I thought, what's the first thing that comes into my mind, and then looked at it. and often the answer will be there, and that's more likely to be correct, and you've kind of thought it through a bit more yourself rather than just relying on the answers. Yeah, it's easier to go through that way. Again, like I said before, it's hard with the time pressure. You've got to get that balance between going through the questions, carefully reading the question and all the answers, and having a minute to do it. So I'm going to give you 20 seconds for the next one. Again, go. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so most of you got that one right. It's EBV. Well done, guys. To those of you who didn't put an answer, I would say in a multiple choice question, always put an answer. There is not negative marking. So even if you don't know the answer, you know, a monkey would have a 20% chance of getting it right, and you guys are smarter than monkeys. So, but it's important to think through and to eliminate answers that you know are wrong. So sometimes you're not going to have, you know, even if you've covered it up and you've thought of the answer, you might not have the answer in your head. And some questions you just won't know the answer to because the syllabus is so expansive. But part of learning how to do MCQs is learning how to game the questions that you don't know the answer for before. That makes sense. So the options become useful for jogging your memory about certain things, which is why it's really important to read through all of them. But it's important to eliminate wrong answers if you don't know what the right answer is. So for this question, as an example, the first thing I'd do is I'd eliminate ones that I've not heard of, because they're unlikely to be on your syllabus if you've kind of done your revision decently, like even semi-decently, been to enough lectures, you'll have heard the terminology for most things that are going to come up in your exam. So in this case, the polyomavirus is not on the Oxford syllabus, or it's certainly not on the left-hand side. I think it might be on the right-hand side. So it's unlikely to be that one. And that's the same for the variola virus. So for both of those, you can just discount right away because they're unlikely to ask you a question about that. Then there are ones that you know are wrong. So adeno-associated virus, and in fact, adeno-associated and polyoma are groups of viruses. So it's unlikely to be the kind of single pathogen that's associated. So that leaves you with EBV and HPV. And you might just know the right answer off the top of your head, EBV, and that's great. But actually, if you know the kind of more common association is HPV and cervical cancer, and you know, oral pharyngeal cancer, which is a bit confusing. But if you know that one, you can kind of whittle it down and think, oh, it's probably going to be EBV. Obviously, lots of you knew that already, and that is obviously the preferred way to answer multiple choice questions. But eliminating answers is important because sometimes you'll be stuck between two, and actually you just increase the probability that you get it right if you've managed to eliminate the ones you've not heard of, the ones that are just plain wrong, and then, you know, you've probably got a 50-50 chance of getting the answer right. So next question, which of these best describes Proteus mirabilis? So again, you've got 20 seconds because this is not a nice one. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1, stop. So none of you got it right. So it's urease negative. So either I've written down the wrong answer, and please do correct me if I've just clicked the wrong one, because it's very possible with Socrates. But it's tempting to go through in the exam all the questions very methodically and in number order. And I could see as the answers were coming in, this one's a bit harder. I agree. I would not have known this off the top of my head, and I would have probably just guessed. So if a question looks unfamiliar or you've read through the answers and there's not one, then don't waste time on it to start with. You know, you will have time in the exam to go through the paper. And if you go through, oh, someone's writing, I could be wrong. I'm very up for that. second year was a long time ago. Also, I was just saying to year 3 before we started, I think it's URIA's positive. It probably is. So I would go for the majority of you getting it right rather than negative. So I thought 0% was a bit small for people not to know the answer for. Yeah, that's probably right. And it's probably just me clicking the wrong Socrates button. Yeah, I'm so ready to be wrong on that. But anyway, the point still stands. With questions like this, where you look at the answers and you think, this one's going to take me a bit more time, there you can mark it and come back to it. And that's a really useful technique, because actually, like we say, with multiple choice questions, you want to just put an answer for all of them. But actually, you want to be able to have time to put the right answer for the ones that you know are right. And if you're going to guess it anyway, don't spend time guessing it at the start. Just do it at the end. So with ones like this, I'd have put a little mark on it and come back to it later. And if you know the answer, great. But if you don't, it's okay, come back to it. And again, this will come in on our next point. There will be some things that you have to memorize. All of the questions I have just picked up from the specimen papers for the Oxford syllabus. So do just look at what they like to ask. They like to ask. Wikipedia says it's positive. Thank you for that, Tabitha. I'm really grateful. So the 78% of you were right and did just know that, in which case I'm really impressed. But again, if it's not something you know, don't be afraid to just mark it and come back to it. If you're worried about forgetting it, the exam software is quite good. I don't know if you guys sat any exams last year or sat MCQs because of COVID and everything, but the exam software shows you a little button, and as you get to the end, it lets you review them, and you can go back and see the ones that you've marked and answer them again. So yeah, don't worry about coming back to things. It's quite logical and important. I know the temptation is to go through every single one in order, but don't worry about that. Okay, next question. Structure 3, so the little photo there, contains. Okay, I'm going to give you 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Brilliant. Auditory nerve fibers. So, final point is that some things you will just have to memorize. You know, it's inevitable, and actually sometimes the question can be really useful in giving you a picture. So I found that, especially with neuroscience, which was my pain in second year, pictures can be really useful for learning things. When it comes to MCQs, I particularly used things like, I don't know, there's Netter's neuroscience flashcards I found really useful, because they've got lots of pictures of neuroscience things, like good ones of the pons and the medulla and the circle of Willis, all the things that you just need to memorize, because they will give you photos like this and they'll ask you, what is this? So actually using visual cues is really useful. When it comes to the questions itself, often these will be like a string of 5 questions, where each one will be structure 3, structure 4, structure 5. So actually just spending a bit of time at the start to orientate yourself. So, you know, if you had no idea where this was in the brain, and fair, it's a confusing photo, actually just looking at the answers can be quite useful. So, you know, with things like endolymph, perilymph, auditory nerve fibers, you're assuming this is the inner ear. Then you can start working what each of them are. So 4 looks kind of like a bone, so it's probably the stapes, and then 5 is the stapedius muscle. And then we can see on the left-hand side, you've got the cochlea, and coming out of the cochlea, the thing with lots of fibers is the auditory nerve fibers. So just looking for learning through diagrams is really useful, and just memorizing those things. I made myself lots of flashcards and actually sharing them as well. We had a really lovely third year in the year above us who just shared all of their neuroscience diagrams with us and said, I use these for learning, and then we made our own off the back of them. So within your colleges, ask your college parents, and I'm sure they've got stuff that they use to revise that you could piggyback off and use. So that's the end of the first bit, looking at MCQs. So thinking a bit more on essays now. So I'm assuming, and do correct me if I'm wrong again, I tried to look on the web learner, there doesn't seem to be any information on there about exams this year. I don't know if you guys are using Canvas or something, but I'm assuming that you get 3 hours to write a choice of 3 essays out of 10. So my general strategy for essays was I'd spend the first couple of minutes looking through the questions and thinking about which topics I knew most about. And then before I started planning any of them, I had an idea of which 3 I was going to do. So, you could do it where you choose one, plan it and write it, choose another, plan it and write it. But I think the benefit of choosing the 3 before you start is that you subconsciously, you're not aware of it, but you're kind of thinking of ideas for the other 2 as you start to plan. And then it makes it quicker and easier to plan for the others, because you've kind of thought a little bit while you're writing your first essay, what you might want to say for the other 2. So obviously with part of that comes, again, reading the question. So it's important to look at the command verb. So understanding what the examiner is asking is a really basic part of writing essays, and often the command verb is crucial for this, because it defines the kind of argument or the kind of essay they want you to write. So, the differences between describe and discuss seem quite subtle, but actually discussion is more of a tutorial style, pros and against, kind of what is your opinion, whereas a description, they probably want you to give evidence backing up what we know about these different things and kind of talking about the characteristics. The examiners will have really pored over what terminology they're using to drive you in a certain direction, so pay attention, particularly to the verbs that they're asking for. Okay, so after having read the question, thought through exactly what it's asking, I'd say the next important thing to do is to plan out the essay. So for essay-based exams, the most useful way to revise to look at past exam papers. So pick a few questions and plan them out. This will not only help you remember what you know and recall it, but I also found that essay plans was really useful for revision, because I just learned my kind of headings for essay plans, and then when I came into the exam was able to just copy them over and kind of add in and write out what I needed. Would someone mind typing in the chat, are your essays, your essay exams, are they online closed book or online open book? Online open book, brilliant, thank you Tabitha, on Inspira. So if they're, so are you not allowed to access anything else? Oh, I suppose you could do written essay plans. You're not online invigilated then? Sorry, I tried to find this out, but no one was able to tell me. So making essay plans is a really great way to revise, because actually, people are typing. No invigilation, you really hope. I hope so for you too. So my finals were not online invigilated, but they were online. And actually essay plans were really useful, because often if you prep a decent number of essay plans, then you can just write them over in the exam and you've got the headings there and you can go through them. So actually not only is it useful for thinking through what you know, because of course you don't want to just be copying stuff over. Actually, the questions will never be exactly the questions that have come before. They have a slightly different angle. But if you know your stuff well and you've got a decent essay plan as a kind of skeleton structure, then you can adapt it for the exact question. So thanks for that, guys. So when it comes to planning essays, there were kind of 4 things that I focused on in my plan itself. So subheadings I found so important. So kind of looking at what are your main points, because these are going to be the pins that your essay hangs on. So if you get these straight away, it's really useful. I know not everyone uses subheadings, but I found them really useful for just pointing out to the examiner what the paragraph is going to be about. Because if you think how many exams they're going to be reading, actually they're not going to scrutinise every single one of them. So if you make it really obvious to the examiner what you know, then you're more likely to pick up points for kind of knowledge-based things. So the second one was experimental evidence. Yes, you don't need it to get good marks, but if you're aiming for the kind of top marks, experimental evidence is really important. It's really easy once you're in the flow of an essay to forget about the experimental evidence that you've actually learnt, because you'll have picked up a lot in lectures and tutorials. So I found that writing down a couple of examples in my plan and where I was going to put them meant that I hadn't just shoehorned them in randomly. They looked more like I'd thought about them and knew them well, and it just made sure I didn't forget them. Diagrams, like subheadings, this isn't compulsory, but I found them really useful for structuring my essays and to break up the text for the examiner. So when making essay plans, I'd plan 1 or 2, I'd draw them out, and then photograph them on my phone. And actually for finals, I photographed all of my diagrams before. So, you know, you've got the classic ones. You know, if you're in first year, you're thinking about the PCT and kidney transport and, you know, ion channels and stuff. For second year, I don't know, you guys will kind of know what diagrams you've had to draw out for tutorials. And I photographed them and saved them all as JPEGs to my computer, so that in my finals I actually just copied and pasted quite a few of them over, because I'd already made them, you know, they were my diagrams, but I didn't have to rewrite them, upload them again, and it just split the text up a bit, and I think made my exams look a bit nicer. Again, if you're drawing them from scratch, I wouldn't do anything you can't do in under 30 seconds, because anything that's more than 30 seconds is too complicated to include as a diagram. Actually, if you're doing diagrams in an exam, they need to be simple enough that you can draw them quickly. And so the other thing I wanted to talk about briefly was introduction and conclusion. I know from my second year exams, these were the first things that went out of my head when you're rushed for time and struggling to get things in. But actually, the fact that you're all here means that you want to do well and be organised and all of that. And actually having a good introduction that lays out your points and then a conclusion is really important and can really just bump up your marks a bit. Particularly your conclusion. This isn't so much the case for second year, but actually if you can get into this habit for second year, finals becomes a lot easier. But it's one of the places where having a bit of an original thought or a kind of creative idea or a suggestion of what could be done further is really useful. Because most people, and I definitely did in second year, for conclusion, just wrote a 2-sentence of like what I'd written in the exam, basically. But that's a waste of time, because it's just a kind of minute writing what you've already written, what the examiner's already gone through, and they're not really going to read your conclusion if that's the case. If you write a conclusion that's got some extra information or your own thought, so, you know, maybe this is an interesting comment on the way these experiments were carried out, or kind of what we don't know about this structure in the brain, or a recent update on a clinical thing, actually that's a really good place to put that information, because it shows that you've thought through the topic a bit more and you're interested. You know, examiners like to see that students are interested in the essays they're writing rather than just writing for the exams. It may feel like you're just writing an essay for the sake of an exam, but you don't have to show it that way. So we're going to go through now an example of an essay that I wrote for finals, for second year. So let's do this one. How is antibody diversity generated in the body? Describe ways in which antibodies are used clinically. So first thing I did was think about the command verbs. So how and describe. So for the how, we're looking at a process. So step by step, how antibodies are generated throughout the body, the different stages, different places, and it's how is diversity. That is the kind of point of that verb. And then describe. So we don't need to go into as much detail, but we do need to outline the different ways that antibodies are used clinically, rather than giving the kind of mechanism of action of each of them. It's broader than that. So having looked at the command verbs and what the question is asking me for, I went for subheadings. So this is what I came up with. So you want to cover the key steps in the process. Obviously, there are loads of ways that antibody diversity is generated. If you're going to focus on the main ones, VDJ recombination. So in that you talk about recombination signal sequences, the RAG complex, and importantly, how that generates diversity, which is the whole point of the essay. So you talk about addition of new nucleotides, the different genes coding for V, D, and J, and then the diversity that comes in joining them. You can then talk about somatic hypermutation, so clonal expansion in germinal centres, how activation-induced deaminase works, how most mutations will decrease affinity for an antigen. Then you could talk about class switching, so it's a slightly different view of diversity, which is quite interesting, you know, rather than at a genetic affinity for the antigen, it's antibody function. So you talk about the different machineries, the class switching recombinase, and then clinical use of antibodies is obviously important because that's the described bit. So in that, you know, you could talk about the two main things I think are diagnostics and ELISA. Diagnostics and therapeutics. So diagnostics, things like ELISA, and then therapeutics, so, you know, direct killing, cytotoxic delivery, antibody drug conjugates. So because that is quite a complex kind of idea, the clinical use, I would suggest that might be a good place for a diagram. So Blue Peter, here's one I made earlier. This is quite a useful mind map, because then you can talk about the two arms, so diagnostics and therapeutics. And then you wouldn't have to be so detailed in your description of them, because you could say kind of these are the things. And it's quite useful if you're running out of time and you spent most of the essay focusing on antibody diversity and how that's generated, then to just do a little bit of like, these are the ways that these are the clinical uses, and kind of brief overview of what each of them does. So then thinking about experimental evidence, so often I went back through lectures and looked at that, and also in textbooks they'll sometimes have the kind of seminal papers, and these are the ones that are quite good to quote because they're often quite basic experiments, even though they don't sound basic. So the big one for VDJ is the Tonigawa one. So they used DNA from mouse embryos and plasmacytomas. They digested it and used gel electrophoresis, and they found that the genes for antibodies were far apart in embryo cells but joined together in lymphocytes, which kind of shows that recombination and the cutting out of different sequences to join together. And then for somatic hypermutation, there were two different models of how that worked, whether it was mRNA or DNA editing, and they found DNA mutations in what's known as hyper-IgM. So that's where you get failure of class switching, so you get mostly IgM produced. And since it's a DNA mutation, it suggests that it's at the DNA level. And then finally, it's always quite good to have some clinical examples in there. So particularly for clinical use of antibodies, there's the Amelia study, which compares trastuzumab, which is a monoclonal, to HER2 positive breast cancer mostly. So obviously, if you are on Innsbruck and you're open book, you can do some Googling of these kind of things. But I would really suggest you have examples before, because if you're going to find relevant examples, you don't want to be Googling them in the exam. So make a list. Actually, the benefit of an open book exam is that you can have that information with you and not have to learn all the names and years and dates. You can much more easily put in a couple of pieces. You don't need loads, just a couple of pieces of experimental evidence, and it really bumps up your marks. And it just shows that you're a bit more well-read, and yeah, makes the examiners like you a bit more. So then finally, you'd want to think about an introduction and a conclusion. So introduction, kind of thinking through the subject. So what do we need to talk about from the question? Definitions is a good one. So what are antibodies? What are you going to talk about in your essay? So I would say the three main mechanisms of diversity generation are, and then finally the therapeutics that are used and the diagnostic techniques. And then, like we said, it's often quite good to have a different spin for the conclusion. So how might these therapeutics develop further? What don't we understand yet about antibody diversity? A lot. And how might we use the diversity of antibodies in nature? So obviously, it's not directly in the question, but when I put this, I was thinking particularly, there's been a lot of stuff recently about llama antibodies, which are very cool and are a lot smaller than human antibodies. So they're looking at them to think about a general flu vaccination, so one that's not type specific, so people wouldn't have to be vaccinated against flu every year. So yeah, think about the subject on a bit more of a lateral level, and don't talk about it lots. But if you're going to put in a kind of offhanded comment like that, it's quite fun, and it just shows you're interested and have read a bit more. So that's all about exam technique. Obviously, a really important thing about exam technique is revising effectively, because if you don't revise effectively, then you've got nothing to write in your exam. So just a final couple of slides on that, because as second years, you have sat exams before, and I'm sure you've all got your own ways of revising. So firstly, I think deciding what to revise is quite important. Whatever medical school you're at, the syllabus is going to be long. In Oxford, it's 83 pages long. Obviously, the aim is to know all of that, but in reality, you're not going to have time to, and you're definitely not going to know it as well as you'd like to. So working out what you're going to prioritise revising is really important. I propose using a colour-based system for each topic. So if you haven't started revising already, don't worry. If you've already begun revising, it might be a good kind of audit to do on your revision. But just go through and kind of highlight on the syllabus or kind of on virtually where you feel you're at with each of the subjects. So, you know, green, I'm comfortable with this one. I could write an essay question on it and answer them. This doesn't need much revision. I might want to revise it because I know that I do well when I do revise it and I know the stuff, but I don't need to. Amber, kind of, I know what this subject is about, but I'm not 100% comfortable with all the specifics of it. So I need to spend a bit more time revising this. But if I don't have time, it's not the end of the world. And then red are the kind of, I don't know what to do about this one. I need to revise it. So this is what I would have done if I was going back to doing Path 2 years ago. So yeah, just think through what you're revising and how to prioritize your time. So, you know, spend a bit more time on the red topics, dip in and out of the amber ones and keep the green ones kind of ticking away. So yeah, just think carefully about how you strategize. So how to revise. Back to Socrates for a second. Go through. Everyone just put down one technique that you use for revision, because I'm sure you'll have different ways of doing it. Flashcards, great. Anki, I love Anki. It's a great one. Summaries, that's a really good one. Drawing diagrams, make notes on the syllabus. Yeah, these are all really good. So yeah, I think the point being that there's not just one way to revise, which you all knew, but I came across this diagram when I was putting this together and I quite liked it, thinking about the kind of different ways that we revise and where they fit on the revision spectrum. So, you know, we talk about flashcards. Flashcards are very detailed focus. I mean, mine definitely were like paragraphs of writing, but, you know, they're supposed to be like keywords, facts, definitions, the kind of short, snappy points that you can pick up, turn over, and have got right or wrong, rather than spending, you know, 10 minutes reading through tiny handwriting on the back of a flashcard. Anki quizzes are really good for details, ideas in context. So particularly thinking about the answer in terms of a question stem or in terms of a diagram, like we saw with the ear question earlier. So that's a question in context. And then I think really important for essay papers are doing practice papers, and that is a really important way of revision. Don't feel like you need to do the whole 3-hour exam paper, because I don't think that's always the most productive. But if you have 15 minutes, open up a past exam paper, choose 3 questions and plan them all in, you know, 10 minutes that you will have to plan them in the actual exam, then that's really useful use of revision time, because from that you can see, oh, I can't actually plan an essay on calcium regulation in the body, so I should probably go back and revise that a little bit more. And it's just quite a good way to make sure that you've covered most of the topics that are going to come up in exam and have the breadth of knowledge to answer exam papers. So, when to revise? Good question. So the day-to-day revision bit, obviously I would not advise cramming. You might have been able to do it somewhat with sociology last year, and I definitely did. And you can leave a fair bit of your psychology just to put into short-term memory the night before. But I would recommend starting far in advance of exams and kind of scheduling revision so that you're able to revise all the topics you need to do before the day. Don't worry if you've not started already and you're not able to do that. Just start now. Start with the red things and, you know, go through what you know you need to revise rather than everything, and prioritize. And you will make it. Like, you will make it through the exams if you just start now and start steady rather than cramming the night before. But also, it's important to remember, like I'm sure your college parents or your real parents have told you, that it's a marathon, not a sprint. I actually worked too hard for my prelims and I got quite ill. It was fine by the time I came to it, but I did not enjoy summer at all because I was just exhausted. So actually, when I came to sitting my second year exams, I was really strict on when I worked. So I said that I wasn't going to be in the library past 10 o'clock, which to some of you will sound stupidly late to be in the library, and others will be the time that you arrive in the library. But actually for me, it was I'm not going to work past this time, and that's fine. I don't need to compare myself to other people who might be in the library past that time. You need to remember that you do just need to sleep and eat and do other things, because you'll be better for it if you do that. So my kind of top tips as exam mum, take a day off. A lot of you will sit there thinking, I don't have time to take a day off. And I was definitely thinking that. But actually, a day off was the best thing I did for my exam revision. The temptation is to work all the way through the week, to tell yourself that you really need to work all the way through the week because you're doing some resting each evening, or everyone else is working all the way through the week. But actually, they're probably not working as much or as productively as you think. So comparing yourself to the amount of revision other people is doing is fruitless. So last year I took every Sunday off, and honestly it changed my university experience. It gave me time to go out of Oxford, to go sit in Port Meadow for long afternoons, and I just didn't feel bad about not revising because I didn't have to, because it was my day off. Nowhere else in life will you not have a single day off in a week. Most workplaces, even as a junior doctor, and trust me, I'm on the wards at the moment talking to F1s, they have days off. You need it for your mental health, and particularly at the moment. If you take one thing away from this whole lecture, and I know it has been longer than I said it would be, please take time to rest and take a day off. Honestly, I think I did well on my second year exams because I did, and I was a lot more rested. It can be any day of the week. A weekend is obviously best because more things are open. But yeah, don't work every day of the week. We're not meant to as human beings. Secondly, use the people around you. I know definitely with medicine, the temptation is to get quite competitive with each other. But actually, especially with Oxford, where you're just graded and, people get higher marks than other people. But in medicine, you guys are all learning to be doctors. Actually, it's all about teamwork. You'll see that on the wards. It's just admitting what you don't know and asking others for wisdom and sharing what you know with them. Actually, you will have other medics, other biomeds in college and friends in other colleges who do medicine, and you guys know what each other are going through, both kind of on an intellectual level, but also mentally in the kind of stress of it all. So support each other. Don't only revise together and kind of help each other out with that. If you've got, our year group had a Quizlet group, and we just all put different stuff on there, and it was great because people put really great Quizlets on there, and you just felt it was a lot less of a competition and more of a, let's get through the exams together, guys. So one of you start that, but also just check in on each other, support each other, go for breaks together, eat together, all those things. Just help one another. Don't be in competition because that's just not nice for any of you. And finally, most of you shouldn't need reminding, do not forget manslaughter. You need to look at the bottom of the pyramid first. So food, water. I drank an unhealthy amount of Diet Coke during my finals and prelims. Not brain healthy. Make sure you're sleeping well. 8 hours a night is enough and needed. And then, safety and security. Get help from uni and college services if you need it. It's not a shameful thing. There are loads of people going through similar things at the moment, especially with COVID. So, don't feel like you're making things up or it's just exam stress. Actually go and see people. Notice that achievement is fairly near the top of the pyramid. And, it's not the most important thing in life. Making sure that you are safe and that you feel loved by those around you are far more important, even if it doesn't feel like it with exams looming at the moment. So does anyone have any questions? I realise it's quite a generic kind of revision lecture. But if anyone's got any questions, feel free to either type them in the chat or to type them on the Socrates page that is just opened up. My email address will be on the end of the PowerPoint and on the slide handout. So if you've got any specific questions for revision, I'm very happy to answer any emails or anything. But yeah, best of luck with exams. You guys are going to be absolutely fine. I know it probably feels a bit scary right now, but you will get through them, and they're not the end of the world.